What's one historical fact that they won't teach you in school? Japanese World War II crimes are seldom discussed in detail. When I was in school, my French teacher decided to ditch the whole teaching us French thing one day and spent the entire lesson talking about his father's experience in a Japanese POW camp and the atrocities he'd witnessed. Think it was an anniversary day or something, as wasn't relevant to a bunch of British kids doing French otherwise. One of the most memorable lessons I ever had though. My grandfather was a psychiatrist for the British Navy as the war was wrapping up and treated many POWs held by Japan. He was pretty fucked up about it and did not care for the Japanese. The poetry written by Chinese warlord Zhang Zongchang. You tell me to do this. He tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go fuck your mother. After seeing a basketball game for the first time, he allegedly asked, "Why the hell are they fighting over a single ball? We're the hosts. Are we seriously this poor?" He ordered all the players be given a basketball. The circumstances surrounding the death of Meriwether Lewis, of Lewis and Clark, are shrouded in conspiracy. In the months leading up to his death, many people reported that Lewis had become paranoid, claiming that he was being followed and that his life was in danger. In a desperate attempt for help, he sent a letter to his close friend, and then President Thomas Jefferson to request an audience. While traveling along the Natchez Trace, he stayed a night at an inn. During the night, the owner reported hearing multiple gunshots but never went out to check on the source. In the morning, Lewis was found dead in his cabin, sitting against the wall looking at the door, rifle in hand and shot in the back. In addition, while the room was ransacked, the only missing objects of note were Lewis writing back and personal documents. After an official investigation, his death was ruled a suicide and all further inquiry into the instance have been barred by the US government. While Lewis himself did not have any immediate descendants, his extended family have submitted requests every year to have his body exhumed in order to confirm the cause of death. To this day, their requests have unanimously been denied. Interesting. If it was a homicide, I wonder who would have had it out for him. Would it have been a robbery or was it something more sinister? So, that is a fascinating line of questioning. It's important to understand what happened to Lewis after the expedition. As a reward, he was granted governorship of the Louisiana Territory and settled in St. Louis. A major part of Lewis' policies revolved around the integration of native tribes into the Union and recognizing each as their own independent nations within the United States. As part of this, he was a huge advocate for upholding the treaties and respecting native lands. At the time, this was not a particularly popular stance, and it led Lewis to butt heads with his territorial secretary, Frederick Bates. Without going into too much detail, Bates basically did everything he could to work against Lewis in an attempt to make the man seem unqualified for his role as governor. It was during this time that Bates allegedly started to spread the rumor that Lewis was addicted to alcohol and opiates, leading everyone to ignore his statements that there were people plotting against him. The running theory is that Bates may have hired a hitman to attempt to kill Lewis and then take over the role of governor following his death. I was 28 when I learned about the Tulsa Massacre. It happened in 1921 in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a thriving African American community often referred to as Black Wall Street. Over the course of 2 days, a white mob attacked the area, destroying homes, businesses, and churches. An estimated 300 people were killed, and thousands were left homeless. The violence was triggered by a false accusation against a young black man, and the aftermath saw no justice for the victims. For decades, this event was deliberately omitted from history books, leaving many unaware of its existence. Learning about it made me realize how much history had been hidden or suppressed. If you dig a little deeper, you'll find similar events in a lot of southern states. The localities were smaller and less people were involved, but the incidents involved murdering whole communities of black families. Oftentimes, this was done with the support of local and state governments. I am in my 60s and still learning about these atrocities. Not just blacks but Asians too. Anywhere the KKK flourished, there was trouble for non-male, non-whites. When we learned about Prohibition, it was presented as kind of this silly historical mistake. It was years later when I learned that in the 19th century people were drunk basically all the time, in part because very few people had access to clean drinking water, and would drink booze instead, which was often cleaner, safer to drink. So a big part of the anti-booze movement was providing safe drinking water, and we owe a lot of our drinking water infrastructure, like available public drinking fountains, to teetotalers. I actually thought it had something to do with domestic violence, and men getting drunk then going home and beating their wives. Couldn't tell you where I heard that though, obviously not in school. Men also drank a lot in those days, like a ridiculous amount. As the other commenter said, they'd be drunk most of the time. They'd also be spending an ungodly amount of their wages on alcohol. This is another reason why women were such a big driving force behind Prohibition. Men were still the main breadwinners in the family, so it damaged the whole family to have him spending so much money on alcohol every day. Like if you look up the statistics on how much alcohol the average man used to drink pre-Prohibition, it's insane. I think they drank on average something like 80 bottles of whiskey per year. The Harrying of the North. William the Bastard burning whole villages to the ground in the north of England to cement his rule over the country. In school, it's usually 1066, Hastings and bam, William the Conqueror. Here's the Tudors. Honestly, one of the worst genocides in English history, and it barely gets a word in. I was reading about it before, and he wiped out roughly 75% of the people living there. Then killed every animal he could find, even having archers shoot birds, so the other 25% wouldn't have anything to hunt and starve. One of his own monks living at that time wrote in one of his history books, "I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him." It's really obscure, but American chestnut trees were all over the east coast of the US up until around 1900. Then they all got infected with a fungus and now they're critically endangered. Here in Mexico, Las Guerras Indias, the Indian Wars. Throughout the history of the Spanish colony to independent Mexico, the government have been hunting and displacing the indigenous people from the north, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and the south, Yucatan, the Mayans. There were many massacres, including some of the most obscure battles in both La Guerra de Independencia, Independence War, and La Revolución Mexicana, the Mexican Revolution. Yet, these acts were never printed in the Mexican public history books. And even today, when a great renaissance of indigenous culture is happening, the country still neglects that this war has happened. Before he died, MLK Jr. was hated by liberals for opposing the Vietnam War. His convicted murderer said he didn't kill MLK. The King family sued the US government for $1 to prove the government were part of the conspiracy to kill MLK, and won. The smell. Most times in history smelled awful. Really? Sometimes when I look at old paintings, I can't help being glad I can see but not smell the people. Thankfully, the human brain can eventually filter out most consistent stimuli, so nose blindness to the awful smells was very likely. In 1914, the Serbian government and military did conspire and organize the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand with nationalist terrorists, and that was already known back then. World War I wasn't just Austria-Hungary and Germany looking for excuses to go to war and blaming Serbia for something one Serbian guy did. By the way, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia that basically said, "Forbid nationalist propaganda against us, punish the military officials that we 100% know are implied in the affair, and let us investigate on your soil," with the last part being what they refused. To be fair, the Austrian demands were made intentionally outrageous so Austria would have a casus belli to go after Serbia and punish them directly for their involvement. The Bhopal disaster. A factory in India owned and operated by Union Carbide Corp was making a pesticide. Through a combination of neglected maintenance, poor safety standards, and an undertrained workforce, a leak occurred. Over 500,000 people were poisoned, with upward estimates on deaths related to the incident being approximately 16,000, and is the world's worst modern industrial disaster by a wide margin. For what it's worth, I don't think they don't teach you this in school because the man is trying to hide it from you. I simply don't know a context that it would come up in outside of a safety or regulatory class at the college level. The actual Pilgrims were not the good guys in any New England history. Religious bigots, to be honest. It is worth to be told that they were so extremist that they were banned in England. That's why they moved to the New World. They were religious fanatics you should be ashamed to be related to. That the African slave trade was never exclusive to the West, and imagine how horrible it was in the States. It was multitudes worse abroad. Worse that slavery is still alive today in numbers-wise is far bigger than it was before the American Civil War. An old guy I knew was a UN peacekeeper during the Congo crisis, early 1960s. According to him, slavery was still widespread in the rural areas which were outside of direct government control. Just about every family owned a slave or two, usually pygmies, who were regarded by the locals as animals to the point where they were often butchered and eaten if they were old, injured, or otherwise unable to perform work. The old man saw plenty of combat in that conflict, but he maintained that simply seeing the atrocities the locals committed against each other was far more traumatizing than being shot at. I only learned recently that the numbers of people brought from Africa to North America is a fraction of that taken to South America. The reason there are so many more black people in America is that most of those who went south died. In the Middle Ages, they actually used to smear swords in poo in order to try and poison the opponent with bacteria. Do you have a source for that? As far as I understand, the risk of rusting your very expensive sword or having it stick in your scabbard was enough reason to keep it clean. I've read that longbowmen would stick their arrows in the dirt and draw them from there, which would in fact introduce bacteria in the wounds they caused. But the feces on swords thing seems to be a myth more than anything else. What's one historical fact that they won't teach you in school? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.